Well, Aaron, it's a pleasure to welcome you back again onto the show. Because last time, obviously, I wanted to talk to you about Gobekli Tepe, but I just thought it wouldn't do
Yeah.
it justice to rush it through. And you've got a lot to say, and it really is a pleasure to welcome you back.
Thanks for having me back on Beyond the Paradigm with you.
No, it was a fascinating episode with you last time. And it's had a lot of views on Spotify and on all the podcasts. Like I said, I've just been talking to some people, obviously, doubting the new age of the earth and things like that. But obviously today's topic is
Yeah.
Göbekli Tepe, and I was first made aware of this, as probably quite a few people recently have, on Netflix with Graham Hancock's Apocalypse. I forget what it's called now. Ancient Apocalypse. This series that I watched, there's about 8 episodes, and one of them's on Göbekli Tepe, which is
Yeah,
obviously in
sure.
Turkey. Now, Graham Hancock's obviously very good he's quite knowledgeable and everything, but he isn't a Christian. And I wanted to talk to a Christian about Göbekli Tepe, someone who's researched it, and that's you. Um, how did you first come to start looking into Göbekli Tepe? Because you've obviously wrote the book Guardians of Gobekli Tepe.
Yeah. I had uh, a uh, a person who follows me. His name's Roger out of Canada, and 5, 6 years ago, Roger had contacted me about Gobekli Tepe, and he simply asked if I had heard about it, and I said, "Yeah, I've heard about Gobekli Tepe." He said, "Well, you should really look into this." And at the time, uh, I I just didn't really have a lot of time to look into it. I was still flying on the helicopter. And that took half the month. I was on flight rotation 24/7 for 2 weeks straight. And then I would come home for 2 weeks. And so it was, it was a time issue for me. And Roger reached out a couple of 2 or 3 more times. And finally, I said, okay, let me look into it. And I had heard about it. As a matter of fact, there was another radio broadcast here in America that I did. That's a syndicated show. It goes out nationally on the airwaves at night. And they asked me about the Gobekli Tepe, and he said, "What do you think about those belts on the two central pillars?" And so I looked at a picture. I said, "Those aren't belts. They look like belts, but they're not belts." Well, after I got to looking into this, I had, initially I just had this theory that, I thought maybe I knew what it was. It was in the regional proximity of Mount Ararat, although hundreds of miles away, but I thought maybe it's had something to do with that. But then I realized there was something much more deeper to what I had thought previously. So I really began to dig in and research and read about this, and what I began to uncover astonished me.
So one of the sort of main things about what sort of perplexed the mainstream archaeology is regarding like the age of Göbekli Tepe. And I mean, during a little bit of research I've done, nothing like to the depth you've done. Apparently, carbon dating has dated it as 11,600 years old. But during your research, what's your opinion regarding its age?
Well, that's a great question. Um, I'll try to unpack it for us a little bit. It's complicated, um, but if you break it down, I think there's some questions about carbon 14 dating that um, they have assumptions or variables into the equation, um, and that gives you an estimated time frame. Now, most people don't realize that carbon 14 can only date, um, uh, obviously it's only organic dating, and most people know that. What most people don't know is that you have to assume that there's a constant decay rate for that. And then you have to assume that there's been no contamination to the sample, et cetera. So those are variables or assumptions that get assumed into the equation. So you have to assume that it's a constant rate of decay. You have to assume that there's no contamination. And there's other things that go along with that. I detail in the book. For instance, if you date a seal that has died on the beach and you know the death of that seal and you carbon 14 that creature, it will come back millions of years old. There's a problem with carbon 14 dating because it can only give us I think a reasonable time frame within several thousand years. Once you start getting past that, it starts the assumption or I think the conclusions begin to skew out. So the further back in time, it really skews off into a much older date, and hence the example of the seal. There's numerous other examples of this. We know that the seal didn't die millions of years ago. It was a recent death. So when you're looking at carbon 14 dating at Gobekli Tepe, they've done this by using little grains that they found at Gobekli Tepe, little remnants of barley and wheat grains and some other organic material, including animal bones. There's other reasons why they think it's 11,000, almost 12,000 years old. There's some other questions that I have about that, but the evidence really is showing possibly that Gobekli Tepe isn't that old. It's not as old as we had assumed it to be. And so this is really where I come in with, as you mentioned earlier, a different perspective. And to my knowledge, I'm the first person to research Gobekli Tepe using a different perspective, and that's the biblical framework of the Old Testament. And by doing that, it gives you a different, perspective on how. So the question is if I believe in the Old Testament and the Bible, where would I put Gobekli Tepe in the Old Testament? And so these are questions that really came up for me that I was trying to answer for myself. And there's reasons for that we can get into later if you want, but this is kind of the initial, research path that I took, but I did use the Old Testament as a framework to look into Gobekli Tepe.
Another sort of, well, call it controversial, but like it's a debated area surrounding Gobekli Tepe is like, what is it? Like, what was it? What's its purpose? What actually is Gobekli Tepe, in your opinion?
Yeah. Gobekli Tepe, archaeologically speaking, when the first reports of the excavations came out, according to the archaeologists that were and are digging at the site, they thought that Gobekli Tepe was just a place that they had came temporarily to and then left. It was like more of a seasonal use. And so now there's evidence to show perhaps that's not the case. Perhaps it was more of a permanent place where people lived. So the use of Gobekli Tepe has several possibilities. one, they were obviously harvesting grains at Gobekli Tepe. Now, if you can imagine, Gobekli Tepe sits up on what they call the Jermis mountain range. It sits up high on one of the highest plateaus in that area, and it overlooks the plain of Haran. This was part of the Fertile Crescent. There was plenty of wild game, deer, these big arc, giant bulls, wild pigs, but plenty of grain, wild wheat, and wild barley. And so they had plenty of resources there. And so we know that they were bringing the grain in. They were grinding the grain for bread. They had plenty of game that they brought back. We found the animal bones that are still on the site, and we know that they were having these ritualistic feastings there associated with the site. What's new to that is that they discovered rectangular structures adjacent to the circular enclosures. Now there's multiple circular enclosures that they have discovered. Most of them are still unexcavated under the ground, but they can see them on GPR scans, which is ground penetrating radar. And there's a lot that's still buried under the ground at Gobekli Tepe. But what they do know is that they've discovered these rectangular structures adjacent to these enclosures, what I call sacred space. So it wasn't a place where they lived. It was a space set apart that they went in and performed a special ritual or a ceremony, and then they came out. There's other reasons for that, but these rectangular structures probably were their homes. And we see in the Neolithic, of course, on the secular timeline later on, in places like Cataclysms, where there's thousands of people lived. That was a major center, and they buried their dead under the floors of their homes. And so we know that this was a practice. Okay. So the function of Gobekli Tepe is severalfold. One, we know they lived at the site, which is new information coming out from the German Institute of Archaeology. Why? Because they found rectangular structures adjacent to the circular enclosures, and these were probably homes where they lived in these rectangular parts of these structures. And some new information that just came out probably within at least a year now, which is relatively new, because information really is slow to come out from these excavations. Part of it is just that they have to look through this and excavate it, and so the information is kind of slow coming out. But some of the new information is that Gobekli Tepe has human burials found under the floors of these rectangular structures. I think there were 2 females, 1 male. I think the 2 females were in close proximity in the same area. I think it was near enclosure A, and then the male burial I think was further away. I think they actually found that I think they found that one in 2012, but they weren't quite for sure what that was about. So now they're kind of getting a better understanding that people lived at the site. They did bury their dead under the floors of the houses, just like we see it's a common practice in the Neolithic that people did this. They would take their loved ones and then they would bury them under the floors. So they didn't have a cemetery like we have. They used the floor of the home to do that. And then the circular enclosures were considered sacred space. So it was set apart for a special function. whether that was a ritual or a ceremony or some kind of libations that they performed in there. They went in, they did that, but then they came out. So we think now the new information coming out of Gobekli Tepe is that the people lived there at the site. But another interesting function, I think, was um, was a religious ideology that they had. And this is the whole purpose of them, I think, even living at the site, is it had a strong religious connotation for them, why they even put it there. And so in conjunction with the stable food source of the plains of Haran, they're up on the Germus mountain range, kind of at the highest point in their area. It overlooks this ancient plain of Haran, which is the Fertile Crescent, part of the Fertile Crescent. There's plenty of wild game, wild wheat, wild barley. And so all because of all this, they came to this one particular site at what we know as Gobekli Tepe.
Now the mainstream obviously tell us that these hunter-gatherers they built it, so just overnight they were hunter-gatherers, and then the next news basically just start building Gobekli Tepe. But who do you think built it?
Well, that's an interesting question. The standard interpretation is that the people that built Gobekli Tepe are in the Stone Age. And this is technically called pre-pottery Neolithic A, which is before the invention of pottery. It's also supposedly before the invention of writing and before the invention of the wheel. So this is a Stone Age people that knew how to start fires and hunt and gather. They're hunter-gatherers. But there's something different going on at Gobekli Tepe that doesn't really measure up with the textbooks about how civilization started. So who built Gobekli Tepe is a great question. We don't really know who the people were, but I think we can identify maybe a more general concept of who the people may be. And this is what I do in the book. But it's interesting that these Stone Age people supposedly in a time where they're just hunter-gatherers, they're coming together in a organized way with a division of labor, building megalithic structures that's not supposed to be there. I mean, they're not supposed to be able to have this technology in this time frame. Yet we see this massive complex built over a 22-acre site that was in continual use for, some say, up to 1,000 years, maybe 1,500 years. But this was a very complex site for a Stone Age man. And how do you quarter or cut these monolithic stones from a quarter of a mile away, and then haul them uphill, and then put them in place without some kind of a reason why? And this is the thing that turns Gobekli Tepe upside down. What my colleague Dr. Judd Burton said it very well. He said it's the paradigm that's changing the paradigm. Why? Because in the textbooks, you'll read that people came together and they formed civilizations, agriculture developed, brought the people together. Then they formed, these cities, or these areas where people came together because there's strength in numbers, and that formed into a society. And because of agriculture and the people coming together, they built defensive positions and walls, and now they had civilization begins to occur, and as a result of all that, then religion springs up out of all this. But Gobekli Tepe in the archaeological record is exactly the opposite of what all that has been taught for a very long time. And that is religious ideology comes first. Of course, the people are there. And then because of this, then agriculture, then people came together in bigger areas like at Catahoula and other places. And then we have kind of this birth of civilization and agriculture comes out. So Gobekli Tepe is very opposite from what we've been taught. If this is the case, that means religious ideology brought people together first. And that is a central concept, a central construct that I have in the book Guardians of Gobekli Tepe. And that is that people were at that site doing something very particular in a religious ceremony. And this is the whole reason why they lived at the site. It's a very central core belief in their life, in the cosmology of the Neolithic mind. It is central to who they are. And so this is the reason why we're seeing all these things that are emerging out of the stones at Gobekli Tepe. And suddenly, little bits of the puzzle comes together. And then when you step back, and what I like to do is take what I call the 35,000-foot view approach, and take a step back and look at it from a wider angle, if you will, and see what the picture is telling us. And so this is kind of the approach in how I research Gobekli Tepe.
Yeah, I love it, this Gobekli Tepe, because it's proper thrown a spanner in the works of the mainstream sort of narrative. And you were mentioning, like it's meant to have been there before even the wheel, apparently, and all this. And
yeah,
when I was looking into Stonehenge, obviously we're told that, primitive people, yet again, they sort of, well, for example, the blue stones on the inner circle are actually from South Wales, Preseli Hills. There's a quarry there that they've located them to. And
yes.
I think the average size, I think I remember reading, was approximately 3 tons. And obviously we're told that they sort of dragged them there, basically. Well, there was a group called Mentor Preseli who tried this in about 2000, going off what the mainstream told them, putting them on pieces of wood, like rolling them along. And it took them a full day to move this thing a mile. And then when they eventually got it to the coast, because they sort of said, well, they must have brought it round the coastal, through the water and everything, they put it on the raft and it just sank. So that was it. It was
Oh
over.
no.
So
And those
what?
blue stones are like hundreds of miles away from the quarry, right?
About 200. They're actually from Stonehenge to Preseli Hills. It's probably the shortest distance, if my memory serves me correctly, is approximately about 200 miles. And they just clearly
Wow.
didn't get there, how they tell us. And then the sarsen stones, which are much bigger, up to like 40 tons a piece, they're from approximately 20 miles away. So it's not like they're from around the corner. So like you
Right.
were
Yeah.
saying there, they've
Yeah.
moved these massive stones in Gobekli Tepe. They've gone up and they're on a hillside. And obviously you've talked about motive, because that's one thing. When I was listening earlier to a discussion on the Joe Rogan podcast between Graham Hancock, I think it Randall Carlson, and some other guy, I forgot his name anyway,
Yeah.
but that's one of the things they couldn't understand, like motive. And that's one of the things that's debated. But like you've mentioned there, there's this, like, religion came first. That seems to what's energized whoever these people are. But in terms of sort of techniques regarding how it was built, what's your thoughts on it? What's like your hypothesis, and maybe how they sort of moved things around and got them into place?
Well, we don't know. We don't know if they were, if they were drug into position, or if they used some kind of wooden, rollers and logs. We don't really know. All that stuff is, if it, if they did, it's long gone now, and we don't have any evidence for it. Um, we just don't know. That's part of the mystery of Gobekli Tepe, is the Stone Age people coming together, building a megalithic site architecture that supposedly they don't have the knowledge to do, or the capability. How did they do it? How did they? And these aren't just, you know, small stones. These are huge stones, several tons, monolithic, which means that they're cut out in one single piece and then brought into position. They found the quarry. I said earlier, it's about a quarter of a mile away. But that's quite a distance, as you were saying in reference to Stonehenge. Even to drag one of those stones 1 mile took them a full day. So this is quite a feat. They obviously had some kind of, some kind of cutting tool or something that they used to cut those stones out of the quarry, and then lift them up and drag them into position and then set them in. Um, it's very interesting because it's complex, it's difficult, and it requires organization and a division of labor that now we understand that the Neolithic had. And I don't think we give the ancients enough credit. We've all been taught this evolutionary picture that they just knew how to start fires. They grunted. They're off hunting, gathering, and all this, but they didn't have any intellectual capabilities. They couldn't, they couldn't do anything else. That's not true. We see that, that there's ancient, artwork in the caves of France that show people, at this time, even before, knew how to draw. I mean, they buried the dead. We see this at Gobekli Tepe, with these 3 human burials I mentioned earlier. We see that, at other sites that's in the region of Gobekli Tepe, they found jewelry such as beads. The you know, so of course, throughout the UK, they found other things like ancient flutes and things like this, bones that were made out of pendants that were made out of bones and other things. These were intellectual people. They were human, and they lived with the resources that they had. But I don't think we give them enough credit. I don't think evolution has happened at all. I think, if anything, humanity is de-evolving. We're not getting any better or any smarter. We still don't really know how they done a lot of this stuff. But look, even with our technology today, we would be hard pressed to try to do it. Just as in the example of the Stonehenge that you used just moments ago, it's difficult. And so this is the question of, how did they do it? But more importantly is, why? Why were they there? And I try to answer some of these questions in the book. But just getting back to the who, this is kind of where I use the Old Testament framework of who I think, at least in a general proximity of where you would put these people. And so if this is the case, then I line it out according to the a biblical time frame of where I think Gobekli Tepe is, and I base it off of the geology of the area, and which is this is an area that's built on a limestone outcrop, and so there's a lot of reasons for this that I lay out in the book, but I think Gobekli Tepe is perhaps not as old as they're thinking it is. It looks old because one, there's no pottery found at the site, and so I think one of the reasons for that is if it's Neolithic. It's Neolithic, pre-pottery, Neolithic A, which is what they say before the invention of pottery. But some of the other evidences that I have found, they're of course circumstantial, but it seems to be younger. And if it's younger, then it's within the invention of pottery. So the question is, where is the pottery? And when you step back and take that 35,000 foot approach, it suddenly occurred to me that these people are living within the resources that they have. And what they have is a lot of stone. And so they're coming out of the flood, out of a great deluge. Humanity gets culturally reset. So now they're starting over. They're coming through, and then you have humanity building back up. Then you have the Tower of Babel event, and of course, this is all from the Old Testament. There's a scattering of the people through the confounding of the languages. And then you have the Ice Age. In the modern geological terms, this is called, this is also in association with the Younger Dryas event. This is another cultural reset that hits the entire planet. Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock talk about this Younger Dryas event. I think it's a mechanism from the worldwide flood, because you have the mechanism that explains the Ice Age, that explains the Younger Dryas event. And so they're culturally reset again for probably perhaps up to 1,000 years. We know that the Younger Dryas, the global temperatures dropped by at least 30 degrees. The world's oceans dropped between 200 and 400 feet. And that fertile crescent that I talked about earlier, and the wild, game and the wheat and the barley and all that in the plains of Iran, all that is now under duress. They're in a full survival mode because of this Younger Dryas event, and they're forced to move. Why? Because the greenery's gone, the animals have moved, and the humanity is now having to move to survive. And a lot of times they're going either underground or in caves, or they're migrating out of that area. And so I think this is exactly what's happening at Gobekli Tepe, is that we see that humanity gets culturally reset again, and they're coming out, but they get culturally reset back to the Stone Age, if you will, because they're having to start over. So they're coming out of a series of calamities, and what they do have is a lot of stone, and they're using the stone, which is a natural resource. There's probably not a lot of clay in that area, so they're just using what they have. So that explains the stone vessels, the stoneware, and the big stone monolithic structures at Gobekli Tepe.
You talk obviously about resets, and we know like the global flood was like a global reset. Do you think there's been like multiple resets? Because I hear this, in different circles, and I've heard, talk of a mud flood and all these types of things. Do you think there's been like multiple resets?
Yeah, there has been. Randall Carlson talks about this, that he believes there's been at least 16 cataclysmic events that's hit the earth in the ancient past. And these are orders of magnitude that would be totally destructive to humanity if one would occur today. This would wipe out everything. You don't come back from these. So we see that folks like Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock have, and others have said there's at least 16. I think that's true. I don't agree with the time frame, obviously, but we do know that there's been a lot of ancient catastrophes that's hit the earth. The Younger Dryas being one of them. I think the Ice Age is one. The global flood was one of the first ones that hit the earth. It culturally resets humanity back. So what do? You're starting over again. And so, this is, I think this explains quite a bit, because this is not just at Gobekli Tepe, this is around the earth. I mean, there's a site in Clovis, New Mexico, here in the States, where some of the very first um, um, points were found, the Clovis Point, and these were, this is during the Paleolithic. But there's an extinction event in the Pleistocene that happens, and there's what they call a cultural dead zone. That there's evidence of habitation, then there's just nothing above that. It's a culturally dead zone. It's like they were there, then they weren't. It's like something happened, and we see this record of this Pleistocene extinction around the Earth. This is where the Ice Age mammals all died. There's some kind of something that happened. I think there's evidence of a magnetic field, pole reversal, a magnetic shift that happened in the poles. There's a study, I think, in New Zealand that just is published, that just came out within the recent years, that in the fossilized trees in New Zealand, they have found evidence of this magnetic field reversal in the tree rings of these ancient trees. And I think this explains why there's probably a reset of the radioactive clocks, if you will, and this really skews how we date things. So it's interesting that the granite rock, Dr. Robert Gentry did some magnificent work on radial polonium halo 214. This is a radioactive element, polonium radio halo 214. And it showed that in the granite rock, this particular polonium 214 had to be functioning and recording in this rock. And it was less than a second. This half-life of this is less than a second. It's like 0.000164 seconds, something like this. And then I think in polonium 218, the half-life is like 3.5 minutes. This is very interesting, because that means that has to be in that rock instantly, within, with at least in some cases, like 218, it's functioning in the rock, in the granite rock, in less like 3.5 minutes. Well, how does that happen over millions of years? So this is part of the time frame that I think is different, and the reason why I think Gobekli Tepe is younger, because of that limestone. We know that limestone's formed underwater. It's a sedimentary rock. And yet there's a big outcrop right there at Gobekli Tepe where they built. So if this is the case, it has to be post-flood, because this is the only way the limestone forms, is a sedimentary rock underwater. And so this is, from a biblical framework, this is post-flood. I think they're coming out of, also out of the Tower of Babel, and then they get hit with the Ice Age and the Younger Dryas, and that forces them to scatter. Why do I think that? Is because of what I think is the indications of language on those stones. Now, it's interesting, because I said Gobekli invention of the wheel, before the invention of pottery, and before the invention of writing. But I think those stones that some think are art motifs, I don't think are all art motifs. Now, we do have animal characters on these stones, and most of these animals represent a Holocene animals, the wild boar, lions, scorpions, snakes, and others. But these are more representative of the Holocene animals. And what I think is language on these stones. And that's part of the mystery, is that if this is language on these stones, this really gives us a whole nother clue on the dating of Gobekli Tepe. And so this is part of the research that I put forth in the book.
Now, I'm going to share a screen with you because there's one thing I want to ask you. And let me just bring it up. Right. So for all you guys who are just listening on audio, I'm going to post these images on my Instagram, but it's pillar 43 what I'm talking about, Gobekli Tepe. Now, this particular image, it's these handbags. So this one's from Assyria, apparently a carving from Nimrod. But Gobekli Tepe has the same sort of images on there, which obviously they're calling, well, they call them handbags, and that's pillar 43, and it shows these three handbags carving along the top of this. And then there's another one which is found somewhere else in the world, which is Olmec Monument 19 from Levanta, and it shows this, what's apparently a man holding a handbag. Now, what are these, Aaron, in your opinion? I know you probably won't be able to give a conclusive answer, but what's sort of the thought on these handbags?
Well, there's a lot of theories out there on what this is. Um, they're perhaps not what we think of as traditional handbags.
Mm,
Um, I think in some of these cases that they could be vessels that contain water, and they're bringing water um, um, in these vessels that basically symbolize life. Now, in the case of Pillar 43, it appears that there's um, wheat maybe that's in these containers, and there's wheat that's coming out of them. Um, the fact that this, I think there's a possibility that there's wheat in these containers. I'm hesitant to call them a handbag, but if it's water or if it's wheat or whatever, I think it has to do with um, something that the Neolithics uh, they were, I think, more concerned with the afterlife, and also in how they live daily. And so this is very evident in Egypt and in other things. When we get into other cultures, they have this very um, central concept of an afterlife. And so everything they did in their normal life prepared them for the afterlife, right? So we see the Egyptians, they would um, prepare the pharaoh for the afterlife. That the heart would have to be weighed against the feather. They would have to say the secret name of the god. There was things that they would have to do. This whole symbology of the sun rising and the sun setting. Um, in regards to Gobekli Tepe, I think on Pillar 43, that it's this the wheat is a symbol of the regeneration of life. It's a cycle of life and death, right? So everything they did had, the sun rising, the sun setting, the 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 wheat has to be, harvested. It dies. They harvest the grains. Now these are wild grains; they're not cultivated. So the grains are very tiny. With any little movement, the grains come out. Um, but this is all a symbology of life and death, the life and death cycle. And so this is part of the regeneration theory, that as in a grain of wheat, that it dies, it gets crushed, it gets grounded. But then if you plant that seed, it comes up as another grain of wheat. This is, I think, part of the theory that Gobekli Tepe serves is that one of their functions um, is to venerate their ancestors, to perhaps to venerate the gods, um, which I think is there's evidence for at Gobekli Tepe. And then three, I think it has to do with the regeneration of life and death, this whole symbology of life and death that they believed in. And so they symbolize that with these hand baskets with the wheat. So it's interesting that the vultures are taking or the wheat's up on the upper part of that stone, like in the heavens, or in the sky. So I think it has something to do with that. We don't know exactly. There's other theories out there, and I think all the theories should be looked at and considered. But I think in regards to the regeneration theory, I think this makes more sense with Gobekli Tepe because of what they were doing in these central enclosures. And so when you look at these so-called handbags or these containers, I think it has something to do with that, but we're not quite sure until we get some more evidence.
Now, I've also heard that in and around Gobekli Tepe, there's like a source of, well, magnetic energy, I suppose you could call it. I mean, is this something you've heard?
I haven't heard that, no. I'd be interested in learning more about that. You know, I don't know. I'd be interested in knowing if they're recording energy from the rocks or from a ley line or exactly what that frequency is or where it's coming from. I know that in rock, quartz can resonate frequency, so we see that. That's common knowledge. I don't know that it's common in limestone, although I think it probably could resonate to frequency if sound was, or some kind of other frequency was introduced through it. I don't know. It's an interesting concept, but no, I have not heard that.
Yeah, I was just listening to a podcast today, and it was mentioned on there. I don't know if you're familiar with the guy Hugh Newman, and the podcast was the Stargate Voyager, and it was Hugh Newman who mentioned he did mention a particular enclosure because there was enclosures, isn't there? And I think it was some particular closure where there supposedly this magnetic energy, and it was the first time I'd heard anything like that regarding it. But I mean, just regarding sort of techniques used to build it, I was thinking of like I've got them wrote down here in front of me. I've put sound resonance, acoustic levitation, all in question marks, or giants. I mean, what do you think the likelihood is that that they could do things like acoustic levitation, or because obviously they've had to move these massive stones somehow. And I know the mainstream, these things are obviously not on their radar because they're not thinking outside the box. But when I was looking into
Yeah.
Stonehenge, obviously the earliest known name of Stonehenge is the Giant's Dance. There's early depictions of giants helping, this smaller figure who they say is Merlin. And then there's obviously folklore regarding Merlin levitating stones. And obviously possibly that may have been with sound or whatever. But what are your thoughts on those, like sound resonance, acoustic levitation, the involvement of giants?
Well, I do think there's evidence of giants historically that the Bible has talked about in the past. Of course, everybody's familiar with David and Goliath. Goliath had four brothers, and then giants, remnants of giants, before the flood, and then of course that's detailed that in the book of Enoch, which incidentally was found amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. And and also a fragment of a scroll called the Book of Giants, which is interesting. Um, and then remnants of other giants after the flood. It talks about Numbers 13:33. So yeah, of course, I believe the giants existed. There's I detail that in another book that I have written. Um, but in regards to Gobekli Tepe, there's no evidence for giants. There's no evidence for acoustic levitation. I mean, how would we know that? It's impossible to know. I think in this case, you have to apply the principle of Occam's razor to this, which says that usually the simplest explanation is the truth. So to go out on a limb to suggest perhaps giants moved the stones or acoustic levitation, is it possible? I know there's been reports of African tribes and other uh, other cultures using acoustic levitation. Uh, so we see all the tribes perhaps using acoustic levitation, like African tribes and others who supposedly have this capability. I don't know if that's true or not, but in regards to Gobekli Tepe, I think we have to use the principle of Occam's razor, which is to say that the simplest explanation is usually the truth. And so applying Occam's razor to Gobekli Tepe, that would exclude giants or acoustic levitation. It's simple. The simple truth of it is, these people uh, knew how to cut stone, and they knew how to move them and to transport them and put them in place. I mean, they knew how to build this megalithic architecture.
Yeah, sort of final question then, but moving away now from Göbekli Tepe, because I just wanted to get sort of your brief thoughts on the pyramids, like sort of the purpose of them. Because I've heard that, that originally that they were covered in white marble and that got stripped off, and that there was a gold capstone, and that these are possibly like energy sources, like almost like a power station. What's your thoughts on that, Aaron?
So regarding the Great Pyramid in Giza in Egypt, this was, of course, what we see now is the stones, the inner stones. There was an outer casing stone which was polished lime, and that would have been a white, uh, brilliant white color. The outer casing stones, it would have been polished lime, and so the original pyramid, when you saw it, would have been white. Now, whether it had a gold capstone on it or not, we don't know for sure. I think perhaps it didn't even have the capstone on it, wasn't completed or set in place, or perhaps it was and it was stripped out. What was there, we don't know. But I do think there's a good theory that it was, it did generate frequencies and perhaps power. Um, it's interesting that there's no mummy been found in the Great Pyramid. I've climbed in the King's Chamber. I've been inside. There's no hieroglyphics in the inner chamber. It's just an empty granite space with what some would say is sarcophagus with no lid. Um, so is it for a burial chamber? Perhaps not. Perhaps it was used for an energy, you know. Uh, I don't know. It's interesting, but I do write a little bit about that in the book Alien Agenda: The Return of the Nephilim.
It's fascinating stuff, Aaron, and like you've said, a lot of the questions they just can't be answered, and obviously it's speculation, but it's something that really fascinated me because it challenged the mainstream Göbekli Tepe, and obviously all these sites around the world are still challenging the mainstream narrative, and we need more and more people like you who are coming at it from a biblical sort of worldview. So
Well, let me,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, if I can, I just, let me just put out another challenge with the evidence on this. I talked about it just briefly, but the language on the stones. which is I think is there's evidence of Anatolian hieroglyphics on these stones, specifically Luvian language. And if this is Luvian language on these stones, which is Anatolian hieroglyphics, one logogram represents one word. And if you're writing on monumental stone, you'd want to conserve space with the logogram. And we know that the Luvians did this. They had a written common language, an everyday language, but they had a formal script for writing on monumental stone. And that was Luvian Anatolian hieroglyphics, which is, I think, what we're seeing on the sides of these stones. If that's the case, there's a word that we know is for sure is a Latin transliteration for Deus, mean deity or God. Another one is a Luvian logogram for house or perhaps gateway. So we see that I think if this is Luvian language, it would also be another indication why it's younger, not older, that there is language on these stones. And if it is language, then combining everything else that we know together, that it could be a lot younger than what we think. If this is Luvian Anatolian hieroglyphics on these stones, I think Gobekli Tepe has to be culturally redated. And there's a lot more in the book, but I think this is probably some of the central things that in the future going forward, I think more excavations will reveal possibly these Anatolian hieroglyphics. If that's the case, we can't put it Gobekli Tepe in the Stone Age. It's going to be a lot younger. And if that's the case, then we have to reconsider the whole dating for Gobekli Tepe. But I think it's interesting that there's this possibility of language on these stones, and I think it's interesting that religious ideology seems to have emerged first, which puts the people together for a specific reason. We didn't really get to talk about that very much, but there's something very specific that they're doing in those enclosures, what I call sacred space. And because of that, I think it's very central to the idea of how these people lived. And it's certainly, we see within the region that they were already worshiping the moon god. And so they had deified the moon, and I think they have deified the bull. And we know that the Neolithics are called the people of the bull. And I think they have deified both the bull, the power over the earth, and the moon, the power over the heavens. And so on the in enclosure D, on the two central pillars that are anthropomorphic, they're 18.5 feet tall. On one about where the necktie is an image of a bull. On the other one is an image of a crescent moon and perhaps a full moon or a full sun disk. I think it's a full moon and a crescent moon. If that's the case, these are, I think, a good evidence to show that they have deified these entities, and that they were perhaps worshiping these two beings that are associated with these images. Again, the powers over the heavens, the powers over the earth, all pointing to this regeneration theory of the cycle of life, what happens after you die, and then these libation ritual ceremonies that they're performing in these enclosures when you die. They take you in there, they do this thing. Why? Because you got to go to the underworld first before you go back to the heavens. And I think this has something to do with the with these enclosures and the constellations in the sky, and this whole this cosmological belief system that they have, your ancestors or your relatives has to do these things for you to enter the afterlife back into the heavens. But it all has to do with the concept of regeneration. And so that's what I'm putting forth in a new work that's coming out soon. But the central idea to Gobekli Tepe is all lined out in the book Guardians of Gobekli Tepe.
It's fascinating stuff, Aaron. I could talk to you for hours on this stuff. It's mind blowing because there's just so much to it and so many areas to cover. Um, just before we go, then, just remind people about your website and the work you're doing.
Yeah, so you can find all my work, any of the books that I've written, Guardians of Gobekli Tepe. It's all available at aaronjudkins.com. That's AARONJUDKINS, aaronjudkins.com. You can follow everything that I'm doing there. I've got a new TV show here that we started called Fringe Pop 321. And you can go and find that on YouTube. You can find some of my books also on Amazon if you want, but everything's centrally linked up on my website. And yeah, so really appreciate you having me on today.
No, it's a pleasure. I actually am subscribed to Fringe Pop 321. I have been for a while. So yeah, I'm familiar with that. It's fascinating stuff that you look into, Aaron. So, like I say all the time on this podcast, I get people on who's done research, and you're a researcher. I'd just encourage my listeners, to go and have a look at Aaron's work. And like you mentioned there, you've got sort of some new research, and love to get you back on to talk about what else you're researching at the moment. So thanks for your time today, Aaron. It's been a pleasure again. I'll be back next week, guys, with another guest. Hopefully it'll be just as good an episode as this one's going to be. So I'm Paul, and this is Beyond the Paradigm.